Welcome to the Ezra Digital 2020 Education Series. I would now like to turn the program over to Steve Bisbee for introductions.
Thank you, Mallory. I am Steve Bisbee, the president and founder of eOriginal, a leading financial services transaction management platform. We enable digital lending from origination to the secondary market. I oversaw the development of unique digital solutions that have replaced paper processes and created business process improvements and capital efficiency for over 600 clients in a digital financial ecosystem. The Electronic Signature Records Association was formed many years ago to educate and advocate for the use and acceptance of digital signatures, records, and transactions. I've been on the Ezra board since its inception. I'm here today with my colleague, Margot Tank, a partner at DLA Piper, and the U.S. co-chair of the firm's financial services sector. She has been helping companies with digital transformation for over 20 years, has advised clients on over 1,000 processes and platforms that enable digital transactions and digital payments, including in the financial services, commercial, and retail commerce, as well as healthcare. Margot is counsel to Ezra and an ex officio member of the board. Margot and I are the co-chairs of the Ezra's Digital 2020 Education Series, of which this webinar is part. Margot?
Thank you, Steve. Ezra members are dedicated to providing, promoting, and participating in Ezra values, which are expertise, leadership, collaboration, accessibility, and technology neutrality. As part of Ezra's educational mission, we've created this education series that is now running through December. The education series provides insight and practical guidance on business, technology, and legal implementation issues that range across a wide spectrum of applications, including remote online notarization, digital mortgage, auto finance, to the use of voice signatures and other biometric methods for authentication, and to 2020 legal and regulatory trends and insights, among other issues. Although eSign was enacted 20 years ago, there's still a learning curve as companies continue to transform their business practices. These issues are even more critical now during this time of social distancing, remote work, contactless consumer and customer engagement. We hope that you will find these webinars useful.
And finally, we'd like to introduce our speakers today, Nick Mejia and Larry Torrey of Wacom, one of the oldest and most trusted brands in graphic tablets. Wacom has a rich tradition of developing and producing high-quality drawing tablets and pens used for electronic signatures. I mentioned to Larry the other day that eOriginal executed the first digital mortgage closing in the early 2000s using Wacom tablets. Nick Mejia is a senior director of enterprise software at Wacom. He is a Master of Science in Soil Mechanics and Engineering Seismology from the Imperial College in London, and worked for several years as a geotechnical engineer. After a period spent writing software tools for civil engineering applications, Nick joined a startup, Peripheral Vision, a company that developed applications for electronic pens. As the head of research, Nick was responsible for developing automatic verification technology and forensic tools needed to support handwritten electronic signatures. When the company dissolved in 2000, he founded Florentis, a consultancy specializing in electronic handwritten signature systems. Florentis was acquired by Wacom in 2011 and expanded the team. The expanded team now develops and supports Wacom's business solution products worldwide. Larry Torrey heads Wacom for business sales and marketing teams in the Americas, specializing in the deployment of cutting-edge digital pen and ink technologies for electronic signatures and biometric signature verification. Larry has over 30 years experience in solution sales and technology development. Larry has spent many years in telecommunications, helping design and deploy large telecom solutions and contact centers at companies such as Delta Airlines, Motorola, and Ticketmaster. He has spent the last 13 years evangelizing and selling electronic signatures and digital transformation solutions in both cloud and in-person environments. Please welcome Nick and Larry. Larry?
Great, thank you, Steve. Appreciate that intro. And so as you noticed from the intro, Nick is the brains of the presentation today, but I'm going to kick things off really quickly. So we're going to talk about digital ink and ink in general. And then Nick's gonna take a deep dive into biometric signature verification and what that looks like today and what it can look like in the future. And then I'm gonna take it back over and talk about some innovative new uses for digital ink. So let's first take a look at ink. So ink's been around for 5,000 years, or at least writing has been around for about 5,000 years. And the benefits of this analog ink, as we've seen it over the years, it's ubiquitous and omnipresent. Pretty much everyone writes. It's expressive. So look at the Declaration of Independence and John Hancock's signature, very expressive. And it's the way that artists express themselves. It's got versatile applications. So you could be spray painting a wall, or you could be signing a document with your signature. It's intuitive, it's flexible, and it's also familiar. And signing on paper has a familiar feel. So let's take that digital. So what's the power of digital ink? Digital ink is enriched in such that you can also be versatile and flexible. So you can write on different media. It's deeper and has more information. So it could have very specific pen information. It could capture the biometrics of that signature. So the pressure, speed, and tilt, for example, which is what Nick will talk about. We can do location and context. You can use artificial intelligence to look at that ink and analyze it and tell what it is, perhaps even the intent of that ink. And then you can enrich it even further with virtual reality and 3D inking. So if we bring all of this together, it's generalized as ink. And again, that's what we will be talking about today. So how do you capture digital ink? It can be captured in a variety of ways. I'm not going to go into the detail, but electromagnetic resonance and AES are two examples of the methodologies to collect digital ink. And they can be captured on any kind of mobile device, and most PC manufacturers have pen technology, or it could be captured on very specific pen display or pen technology devices. And to illustrate the demand of digital ink, Wacom has created over 100 million digital pens and brought them to market. So most major PC manufacturers, as well as software developers, all have some form of digital ink capture and technology. So what are some of the business use cases for digital ink? The one we're going to concentrate today on is signature verification. So that's capturing a digital signature or even a static paper signature and analyzing it. Then other applications could be form filling. So taking a digitized document and completing it with a digital pen. It could be note taking on a variety of devices. So this could be a mobile device, it could be pen devices, or also pen capture, digitization capture devices, or pen displays. Digital education. In the last 9 months, it's certainly been important to be able to teach remotely. And so we've seen a big uptick in digital education applications. And then finally, multimodal input. So it could be input from multiple devices and could even be input by voice. So at a high level, what's captured in what we'll call universal ink is the ink geometry and the rendering of it. So it's converting that sensor data. So when a digital pen hits a digitizer, it captures data and it captures the geometry of that particular data. The other thing it captures is the ability to do ink manipulation. So whether that's scaling it to be larger or smaller, moving it, rotating it, or even erasing it or splitting that ink in half. And then finally, if you bring all of that together and be able to capture that ink in a universal format and potentially doing something else with that ink that was just created, is the ability to exchange those rendering results, that sensor data. So what specific device was that captured on? What specific pen or type of pen captured that data? And serializing that so that it could be manipulated and or in the future. So looking at advanced ink applications, we can capture them on just about any device. They're natural, so it's got a natural feel, and we'll do a demo a little bit later. And it can be active, so it could be interactive, it may be collaborative. So I'm inking and someone else is inking at the same time. So let's draw that out to real world applications. So one of them we'll talk about a little bit later is semantic ink. We'll also talk about 3D ink, but the focus of today's discussion is really about biometrics and ultimately biometric signature verification. So here's where I turn it over to the brains and Nick.
Thank you very much, Larry. Okay, we're going to start off with just clarifying some definitions. If we go to the first slide, because there is some confusion sometimes with the types of signatures that are used in our world. So in our definitions, electronic signatures are those that are handwritten signatures captured on a digitizing device as described already by Larry. We also call these dynamic signatures because they contain all the movement data of the pen. This is not the same as digital signatures, which we refer to talk about PKI, public key infrastructure technology, which is used to authenticate the identity of the signer and secure the document contents. Now, electronic signatures are commonly used with digital signatures. So, for example, Wacom's Sign Per application, which is used to sign PDF documents electronically using handwritten signatures, uses both electronic and digital signatures for that purpose. And the third type is with scanned signatures of ink on paper handwritten signatures. And it might be surprising that Wacom's talking about this when we're moving towards a digital and electronic world. But the fact is that there are a lot of handwritten ink on paper signatures being in business, and we need to be able to handle them. And so our technologies allow you to migrate from the static world to the dynamic. So talking about electronic pen technologies, there are two types of digitized, as Larry has already said, just going into a little bit more detail. So the electromagnetic resonance type, EMR, this was the earliest one developed by Wacom, and it works by the display generating a magnetic field, which through resonance powers the pen. And what this means is that there's no battery or cord needed. Sufficient power is generated in the pen to actually transmit the signal back to the digitizer so that the position can be recorded. What this means is that we can use toughened screens to be used, and this is used in all Wacom tablets, pen displays, and our signature pads. And Wacom devices are known for their durability and resilience. They are very robust and can be used for many, many years without any reduction in quality. The other type, AES, active electrostatic pens, these are different in that they use an electrostatic capacitive pen which is detected by a grid embedded in the display. Now this does need power. It needs either a cord to be attached to it or a battery to generate the power. But it's much easier to integrate into third-party devices. So it is used very widely in some of Wacom's partner companies for things like pen-enabled laptops. So for example, a lot of the Lenovo laptops have AES technology embedded in them. But whatever type of digitization we're using, they all work by recording the position of the pen stylus at regular intervals. And we'll talk about that now in the next screen. So when the pen is moving over the digitizer surface, its position is being recorded at regular intervals, typically 200 points per second. In other words, every 5 milliseconds. And at each point, the position is recorded together with other information, such as the pressure, more strictly the force with which the stylus is being applied to the surface, and depending on the model of device, various pen angles as well. Now you'll see from the top left diagram that each point is represented there, represents a pen event. And of course, as the pen's moving more slowly, so the points are closer together, as it's faster, they're further apart. But the one of the important aspects of EMR and AES technology is that the tip of the pen does not have to be in contact with the surface, unlike some competing devices. And that means we get the movement of the pen between the strokes. And in that top left diagram, you'll see a number of red points. They represent the movement of the pen when it's not actually touching the surface. So what we present actually in the document to the user, of course, isn't a series of dots. We want to represent something that looks like ink. And what we do is effectively join the dots. But it's not just a case of using simple point-to-point connections, of course. We want to generate something that looks convincing as ink. And to do that, we use our own will technology, which Larry's already mentioned briefly. I'm going to go over very briefly again as well. But the important thing to recognize is that the appearance of the signature is essentially synthetic. It's generated from the true biometric data that's captured by the device. So let's move on to the next slide. So the will technology, this is the Wacom ink layer language technology. Now we're on version 3 now because it's been developing and evolving over the years. Essentially what we're doing is taking the X and Y position and Z if it's off the surface, and combining that with information about the force and pressure and the orientation and indeed the speed, depending on the device, and using that to create simulated ink that reflects the way in which the pen would behave if it were true ink on paper. And we use that going through what we call an ink geometry pipeline to actually rasterize the image. And this comes up with the very convincing images that we get. And if we look at the next slide, we can see there are various ways. We can use either vector rendering, and that's what we use for signatures. You can see in the top screen there, on the right-hand side, a typical bit of handwriting with the hello, but also sketching, and also using thicker pens. Again, it's the same pen data, but with different rasterizing methods used here, or vectorizing techniques used. And we can also use the raster and particle rendering to produce more artistic rendering of the pen to create images of the sort on the left. And this is where the will technology is really of interest to the artistic communities, because it can really be used as an alternative to ink on paper. So I'm going to talk a bit more now about the signature data itself now. As we've already mentioned, each pen event, each point, consists of the position, that's the XY position of the stylus tip on the digitizer, the elapsed time since the start of the signature, usually milliseconds or tenths of a millisecond, depending on the device, the force, which is the load applied to the tip, and potentially the angles of the pen. And there are 3 angles we can capture. One is the altitude, and that's the steepness of the pen to the vertical. There's azimuth, the direction of the pen barrel when you look down on it. And there's the rotation, which is effectively the twist of the barrel. So that's the pen event data, and that records the actual movement, and that's the true biometric data. But we also need to convert that digitizer information to real world coordinates. We need to know how many millimeters wide the signature is, for example. So in addition to the pen event data, we capture device information, including the geometric resolution, the sign convention, because some pads use an origin at the bottom left of the screen, some at the top left, and the capture rate if it's done at a steady state. Some devices report the time for every pen event. Some say that it's just a standard rate, and then you calculate the time from every 5 milliseconds. In addition to that, we capture what we call the contextual information. This is like an audit trail of where the signature came from. So it includes the time of the sign, the time of signing and date and time of signing, the name of the signatory, the reason for signing, and a lot of information about the device on which it was captured. So the type and version of the signing device itself, the pen model, the operating system type and version, the network interface card address, because that's a unique identifier which shows where the signature was captured, and various integrity hashes which are used to record the data that was being signed, like the document hash, which is the machine digest that's used to detect changes in the data that's being signed after the signature has taken place. And then all that information is bound up, and we use 2 different storage formats. Wacom has its own proprietary format called the Forensic Signature Store, which includes all this information. And then there's also an ISO standard, 19794, which is strictly for biometric signature exchange. In other words, for swapping data between systems from different manufacturers, but a lot of people use it just as a storage format as well. And if we look at the summary diagram on the next sheet, there we go, you can see the basic structure. So it's like a shell-like structure. And the important thing about the FSS format, this is the Wacom proprietary format, is that it's truly binary portable. So you can copy it bitwise onto a device with different machine architecture, and it still be readable. it's forward and backwards compatible. So we can add information, add streams with new types of information. New applications will be able to read old data and vice versa. It's very compact, typically 2 to 4K. That's for typical Western cursive style signatures. Japanese and Chinese tend to be about twice as large because they take much longer to actually create their names using their characters. The architecture is extensible. It can be secured by standard by obfuscation, but in addition, we can of course encrypt. And we always store the raw tablet data to ensure we've got forensic integrity. So we don't want to be open to criticism of actually changing the data in any way since it was captured. And then from this information, derived metrics such as pen speed, they're not stored, but they can be calculated whenever we want to from the raw data. So now moving on to verification. There are two types of verification methods we support. The first is manual signature examination. And this is necessary in the case of an electronic handwritten signature on an electronic document being challenged so that its authenticity is questioned and needs to be considered in a court of law. When this happens, it's a very similar legal process to the one that's followed for paper documents. So a professional forensic document examiner will be used to examine the question signature and compare it against a number of genuine samples. And then they give it as an expert, give their expert opinion on the likelihood of the signature being genuine, imitation, or disguised. And this is presented in evidence in legal proceedings. Now, you cannot do that sort of examination just using the synthetic image that we generate and put on the document. We need access to detailed information, and they need to be able to get as much information out of the electronic data as they would when examining ink on paper. So we have a special tool for that. We have a number of tools, in fact, but Signature Scope is the most important. It's a specialist tool which is designed to be used by document examiners. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But meanwhile, the other type of verification is, of course, automatic signature verification. So this is for improving security by verifying the consistency of signatures when they are captured. And this is often used in banking situations, especially in Europe. And we have what we call the Wacom Ink SDK for verification, which can verify both dynamic and scans static signature data. So let's look briefly at Signature Scope. Larry's going to do a bit more detailed demonstration of this later on, so I'm not going to talk very much at this time. We'll come back to it. But you can see that when you look at a signature in Signature Scope, there are a number of different views you get. If you look at the top left, that's actually the way in which it would be rendered by the Will engine and as it would appear in the document. Although in this case, we've got an option to show the grid showing the actual size. We can switch that off in the options very easily. The second middle top display is what we call the dynamic display. This shows all the point data, or it can show it drawn as straight lines, but this allows us to play back the data in real time and also to explore it and examine each point in much more detail. You can see all the points on the right-hand side. That's the sort of quality of data you get from the device itself. And from that, we can render time graphs. And in the middle at the bottom, you can see we've got the pressure against time. We can show speed against time, direction, different pen angles as well. And we've also got a summary of the digitizer metrics. So this is part of the contextual data, the metrics showing how you convert effectively from raw data to real dimensions and real times. And the other information, the ancillary sort of audit trail information about the name of the person, the date and time, the reason for signing, and so on. So we'll come back to that briefly later on after I finish my section of the talk. So automatic signature verification using dynamic data uses the extreme amount of information we have in FSS data in order to match between two signature samples. So you can see on the right-hand side, we've got two signatures from ostensibly the same person. And you'll notice that in this case, we're looking at points at regular intervals, not the original pen data. So what we do is we look at pen features at regular spacing through the signature. And what we're trying to do here is effectively what a forensic document examiner does when examining signatures in detail, that we try to find corresponding features between the two samples in question. And the important thing to recognize here is that some people are more consistent in their signing than others, but however consistent you are, no two signature samples are ever identical. They are always different in some respect. You can never repeat exactly. It's a bit like a fingerprint in that type of respect between people. So what we have to do is find a rather elastic method of finding the corresponding features. We use a system called numerical annealing. There are lots of different ways in which this can be done. But first of all, we find the corresponding links between corresponding features. And during this process, we would expect to get a high number of links between points. It's a bit difficult to see on the scale here, but if you look at the little dot between the J and the S, you'll see the top one has 2 points, the bottom one has 3 points. And in the 3 points below, one of them is red. And so in this case, you'll notice 1 or 2 red points around. So not all points will be linked, but the more consistent the signatures are, the more or the fewer unlinked points there will be. And the more consistent they are, the better the match between the geometry at the end of each link. So what we do is we look at the geometry, and then having established that they are consistent geometrically, we then look at the timing associated with each of these links and pressures, and we check for consistency between those. And at the end of it, we return a score of between 0, meaning the signatures are different, and 1, indicating that they're similar. And we also return an indication of the principal inconsistency, whether it's the shape, in other words, the geometry, or the timing, or the pressure. And we also produce an indicator of the signature complexity, which is important for another reason I'll come back to later. Now, so that allows us to do one-on-one comparisons, but using the signature technology we have, we then update a template. So for each person, we can maintain signing history, and we can update a template, and we can gradually expand the number of signatures for each person. And as we do that, we can actually measure their variability. I mean, you need several signatures really to do this effectively. Typically 6 are used, but we can use between 3 and 12. So from that, we can then actually measure the true variability of each person and come up with a more accurate verification score. When we do one-on-one, we have to use global population averages to assess the consistency. As we enroll the signatures templates, so we can then go to individual assessments, and that makes it much more difficult for potential imitators to successfully copy a signature. So that's the dynamic verification. I've spoken briefly about enrollment. If we move on to the next screen, please, Larry. I'm still looking at the same screen. Larry, are you there? We have a problem at this point because Larry is pressing the buttons to move the slides. So we'll have to wait until here we go. Okay, so signature enrollment methods. We need multiple reference samples in order to measure individual variability. And as I mentioned, everyone's signature varies to some extent. So typically 6 reference signatures are used. Now, in many systems, session enrollment is used. Now, this is where, for example, when a customer joins a bank, opens an account, they are asked to sign 6 times in a single session. Now, this is very quick to get the template enrolled, but it really doesn't represent the normal range of variability you'll see from day to day. So it's used because of the convenience, but it does compromise the accuracy of the system. So a better method is to use progressive enrollment. So this is where a banking customer is, for example, visiting a branch regularly. In this case, when they open an account, a single reference can be captured. Then every time they visit, more data can be collected until a full enrollment set is gathered. Now we can do that with our technology because during the enrollment period, we still get some verification results. Even though they're not quite as accurate as the long-term template, at least we get some indication that the signatures are consistent or not. Now, a lot of competing systems can't do that. They have to get a full set of enrollment signatures before they can start verifying. So this is the big advantage with our technology. Of course, the disadvantage is that it takes longer and it doesn't always fit with all business systems. But we do have instances where this does work, and we've had a system, for example, in the UK where this policy is used and progressive enrolment is followed, and the results are very good. You get much better quality data by enrolling over a period of time. And with our technology, you can support both types of enrolment. So you can do it progressively or in session enrolment. And in fact, if you only have a single reference sample, that's fine. We can do verification with that as well. So moving on now to static signatures. We've now covered the dynamic ones. Static are much more difficult. So static images are scanned from ink on paper, and they contain very little information about the stroke direction, the sequence of strokes, the speed of the pen, pressure, and so on. It's very difficult to get a good quality out of this data. It can be done to a certain extent. It depends on the quality of the image. Of course, forensic document examiners don't have that information either. They have to use all sorts of techniques, such as looking at indentation on the tips of biro, ballpoint pens, for example, in order to determine the sequence of the strokes. We can't do that with the scanning. But the important thing to remember is that with an image like this, the edges of the ink, so all the boundaries, are parallel to the movement of the pen. So we can use that to determine at least where the pen tip went. Now, of course, on different sides of the ink, you can see where the T and the H are in Smith. Sometimes one side of the ink isn't the same part of the stroke as the other side of the ink. So we have to look at both sides of the ink, and then we need to do a comparison process. And so once we've got the edges out, then we can define feature points around the perimeter, and then we can use a stochastic process, much in the same way as we did with dynamic comparisons, to find matching features between the two sets. And after that, really the same criteria apply. So accuracy improves with more samples. If we can get six samples of static signature, we get better results than with just one. But the fact is that without timing information, without the stroke sequence and so on, that static verification will always be less accurate and less resilient to imitation than dynamic signatures. So I've talked about the two image types. Where this really scores is where systems are migrating from static to dynamic signatures. So a lot of legacy systems commonly have one or more static images of signatures, and introducing electronic signatures requires a step change from one to the other. We need new reference samples. But what the technology can do here is to check the consistency between the existing static images with the dynamic ones. So the verification uses the shape information for both. Of course, we can't use the timing, pressure, and angle data and so on, nor the pen up data, but we can use the basic shape information. And then we can actually have some degree of security when moving from static to the dynamic systems. And from there on, dynamic signatures can be used. So this technology provides a migration path from static to fully enrolled dynamic verification. Of course, people always want to know what the error rates are in verification. It's a general truth, not just for Wacom's technology, but for any verification technology. There is no such thing as a single error rate. The error rate depends entirely on the quality of the data that's being used. So typically we identify two error rates. One is the false acceptance. In other words, how easy it is for someone else to copy someone's signature. And then false rejection. How often does a person get rejected when they're using, or they think they're signing, use their normal signature? And clearly we want to reduce both those error rates. But they depend on a number of factors. So complex signatures are much more difficult to imitate than simple ones. Consistent signatures, or consistent signers, are much more difficult to imitate than those who are very variable. And legible signatures are much easier to copy than those that are very stylized and are difficult to read. And of course, the error rates also depend on the ability of the imitator and their knowledge of the target signature. So we define actually 7, not quite there yet, Larry. We define seven levels of knowledge. So, I mean, at the very lowest level, if you're trying to forge someone's signature and you don't actually know their name or even what the signature looks like, then clearly you're not going to have much of a chance. If you know their name, you can make a guess at it, but it might not actually be the way they sign their name. They might use an initial, or they might use their middle names or whatever. Then you might have seen a static image, so you can get a better chance of copying that, but you don't know the movements or the stroke sequence, for example. But if you've actually had time to look at and study a dynamic playback of a signature, or to watch someone signing, then you have a much better chance of imitating it. So all these factors combine, and so the really hard to imitate signatures are those that are complicated, very consistent and illegible, and the easier to imitate ones are those that are very simple and very inconsistent. So error rates are used, and they're most meaningful when used to compare the performance of different verification engines using the same data. So in summary, the technology we have handles verification of signatures in a number of different formats. So dynamic signatures can be in FSS or an ISO. Scanned images can be in most common image formats, including BMP, TIFF, JPEG, PNG, etc. We can enroll multi-signature templates to measure individual variability, but we can also verify against single samples. We support a number of different enrollment patterns, session or progressive, and of course single. And the point is that we process data, but our system does not store anything. So for any individual, you will have a template which stores their signing history and perhaps additional signatures, but that's all processed or stored by the calling system. Our technology does not store anything. So in terms of data privacy, this is a very important aspect of the system. The responsibility, as I say, is the system to store the templates. And one thing I haven't mentioned so far is that the templates update over a period of time. So that if someone's signing style progresses, changes and evolves very gradually, then that's going to be tracked by the technology. So that's it from me. That covers the verification technology, and back over to Larry.
Great, thank you, Nick. Appreciate that. So we're going to take just a couple minutes and look at some new use cases for digital ink. I know we were obviously focused on electronic signature and signature verification, but some of these are relevant to inking in general, also document storage and integrity. But some of the other applications for digital ink might be note-taking, so you could share your notes with others. But also with this intelligent ink, you could interpret that ink as discussed, and you could act upon it. So for example, if you wrote notes out, maybe perhaps flight details, or in this case, in this example, right, someone took a business meeting set of notes, there's a date, and that could actually put something on a calendar. It could invite attendees if it recognized it in an Active Directory database, for example. So you could very easily translate ink into actionable items. Also in education, as mentioned earlier, it's become really important to keep students engaged, whether they're in the classroom or remote. So digital ink is an excellent tool to provide the ability to engage and educate in different methods. And very specifically in a demo, I'll talk about semantic ink, and so that's intelligent ink and its abilities to do different things. And then some far-reaching things that are pretty exciting and on the horizon, not too far out, is extended reality. So creating virtual meeting spaces, for example, taking digital notes and throwing them up on a whiteboard, or even doing interactive whiteboarding. I'm still really excited about this virtual signing room. So taking virtual or digital paper and moving it around a virtual room and actually being able to sign the document electronically in a virtual format. But also being able to annotate in 3D environments and then being able to store that data. So here's an example of some designers that would potentially be able to put on mixed reality or augmented reality goggles, look at a building maybe under construction, and be able to add ink and apply notes that say, you know what, this doesn't belong there, maybe it needs to be over this way, or let's move that over 5 feet. Even though the construction is not completed, in a mixed reality environment, you're seeing what's there plus what could possibly be there using digital ink. Similar in design or even remote healthcare. So you have maybe doctors in 3 remote locations looking at a similar image and all inking and discussing and talking about it virtually. And now let's take a look at some live demos. So the first one I'm going to do, and we'll close with signature scope and electronic signature and signature verification. But this one for education, or I talked about meeting notes, for example. So someone has taken a series of notes in their biology class, and they've drawn out a cell, and they don't necessarily recall what all of the notes, the words that they wrote when they drew that off the teacher's whiteboard. And so they've taken these notes, and with a little bit of intelligence and artificial intelligence, we can translate that those written notes into recognizable words and potentially dip into databases. And here we're just going into Wikipedia and be able to take these words that were handwritten, if you don't remember what these were, in cell membrane, what that means exactly. So students could use this, educators could use this, and as described for a business application, these could be business notes, and these could be associates that you participated in the meeting and could link into a database and actually provide incremental data. And then lastly, we'll look at our tool for creating ink. And this could be used by any signature vendor, any cloud-based vendor, or anyone who wants to add extended ink into their application. This is a toolkit that would allow you to create an inking experience in any environment. So that was just me using my mouse. I'm also going to now use my PC that's pen enabled and be able to draw on it and make notes. And again, this could be converted into semantic ink and captured and or stored in databases and then indexed on that particular drawing and then retrieved later. And then we'll close with a very specific demo of signature scope. So I'm going to capture a signature in signature scope using a Wacom tablet. And if you can see this in the video, when the pen approaches, it is activated, but I'll go ahead and sign. And Nick's going to guide me through the way we would analyze this signature.
Sure, thanks, Larry. So we have a number of different displays here. There's a lot of windows in Signature Scope, and we aren't going to show all of them at once. I think you can shut that one down, the one that's drifting there, Larry. So in the bottom right, we have what we call the signature image. This is what the basic rendering that's used on a document. Now, in this case, we've got an option switched on, which shows the real size. So we've converted the digitizer coordinates to real sizes, so we can see how big Larry's signature was there. And Now above it, there's another rendering, if you like, of the image, but this allows playback in real time. So this is something that can pick up a lot of imitation straight away when people are very hesitant, for example. If you look at the bottom left window, this is the pen data. Now, if we click on one of those points there, you'll see straight away that the corresponding point is highlighted or indicated by the cross on the dynamic display there. So this allows the document examiner to look at each point and find particular points of interest and cross-linked between the different displays. Now, if you look at the pressure graph with time on the top left, Larry, if you click on one of the peak pressure points there, and you'll see that click on it, there we go. So you'll see now in the top right screen, that's where that peak pressure occurred. So where the crosshairs are, and it's also highlighted that point in the bottom left display there. So there's complete cross-linkage between these displays. And that's what examiners really like to have when they're looking at data. Let's look at one or two of the other displays. If we click on View now, Larry, and Capture Details. There we go, we need to expand that slightly. So this is the contextual data I referred to earlier. So in this case, this was just a test signature captured in signature scope. That's why it says unknown signatory. That would normally have the name of the person. Then we've got the exact date and time at which it was captured. The reason for signing is a test signature here, but then information about the type of digitizer. In this case, it's an STU540, and the version number of the firmware there. The digitizer driver type is an STU driver. And then the operating system, so we can see that Larry's using Windows 10. That's the interface card he's got on his PC, and the license number he's using. So this is part of the audit trail, if you like. So we can always say that that signature was captured on that device, or we can prove it wasn't captured on another device, for example. So let's close that one down and view again. And this time we'll look at the digitizer metrics very briefly. So this is the information that we record at the time of capture about the metrics of the device, and it's what we use to convert from coordinates supplied in pad format to real world dimensions. So the X coordinates, you can see you've got a million per meter effectively. So we can convert each of those coordinates in the bottom left window into real millimeter positions or inches or whatever. And then we've got the timing data. You can see that this device captures time information on each pen event. So in the bottom left window, if you look at the T column, that's the time, the elapsed time since the beginning of the signature. So you can see that 0.357 is 10,915. So it's a type of counter, and we can see then from the difference in the timer between each point just how much time is being spent. In this case, it's 5 milliseconds. Again, not all devices capture regularly. Some have individual time information against each. It does vary between one device and another. So let's close the metrics window now, and then move over to measures. Now, measures are characteristics that document examiners typically use when comparing signatures. In this case, we've only got one signature. If we had more signatures, this would be tabulated, and it would show, for example, the number of strokes. That's the first item, or the time in contact, or the time the pen was in the air between the strokes, and so on. And they get more sophisticated as you go down. They're all very important measures that are used, and they're ideal when assessing question signatures because they really allow the document examiner to prove statistically that a question sample is significantly different from a set of reference samples. And this is very important in recent years because the credibility of document examiners has been challenged, and they've been asked how they know that a signature is different or consistent, and so it needs to be justified, and signature scope gives the concrete evidence that you need to be able to show there are significant similarities or differences between signatures. So I think that covers signature scope pretty well, Larry. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think that's the end of our presentation. If there are any questions, I think we have a couple minutes before Steve and Margot wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Larry and Nick. That was fascinating, really valuable information and content. I could definitely use, or at least, well, I could still use it now, the note-taking translation, correct spelling, and link to definitions. That sounds pretty practical and everyday use. While we're waiting for questions, I'm going to give a quick overview of the broad spectrum of public policy issues Ezra is currently addressing. It's been a fairly active year. The pandemic, COVID-19, has pushed, as we all know, business online and in a remote form. So there's been a lot of activity. Electronic will legislation is in play. There are a number of states that have now enacted laws that enable wills to be created and signed electronically. There's movement again at the IRS. They've been fairly active over the years in enabling forms, tax forms that need to be signed and filed with the government to be signed electronically, but there's an increase again of pressure to have that happen, also with the Social Security Administration. Ezra has been active in supporting uniform, technology-neutral legislation to enable blockchain. Essentially, the UETA that's been adopted in most jurisdictions supports currently the use of blockchain, and the idea was to not have any legislation that created confusion, uncertainty, or inconsistency. We've been active with the Uniform Law Commission on that point and with the Chamber of Digital Commerce. E-notary, remote online notarization, 28 states have now enacted legislation, continuing the march throughout the country and supporting all of those efforts. The Federal Reserve banks and the Federal Home Loan banks are now accepting e-notes as collateral. We've had involvement and engagement with them over the past X amount of years to get to this point in time. So it's great news, and we continue to educate on those issues. Vehicle titling and odometer issues. We have many members that are in the auto finance sector. So we spend a lot of time trying to bring the ancillary but very important agencies and federal laws and state laws that relate to having the entire transaction electronic work together. So Mallory, I'm going to turn it to you to see if there are any questions before we've got at least 5 minutes. So any questions?
All right, great. Thank you, Margot. We do have a couple of questions. So our first question, is there an ideal speed or frequency of data capture when recording the biometric information from a signature?
Yeah, we've looked at that in some detail. I mean, a lot of the early pads captured at 100 points per second, and that was found to be really quite, well, lower limit, and certainly no less than that. But it does mean that when, for fast signers, you lose a lot of information on the curved sections of the signature. We found the best balance is 200 points per second, and in fact, most of Wacom devices capture between 133, but most of the signature devices are at 200 points per second. Some people think we should go for higher, but actually that doesn't make any sense. We've shown that 200 points per second captures all the characteristics of a signature very effectively. So that's why we've settled on that particular sample rate.
All right, great. Our next question, is there value in recording the pin position when the pin is not touching the signature pad surface?
Very much so. It's particularly important when spotting people imitating signatures, because if you're taking care to do one stroke at a time, then the pen can drift around as people are sort of psyching themselves up, ready to do the next stroke. Someone who's familiar with this, as we all are with our own signatures, there won't be hesitation between strokes. And that can be picked up by seeing how the pen meanders around the pad while people are sort of considering the next bit of ink to apply. So yeah, there's a lot of value there.
Interesting. Are there certain industries that are more inclined to use this type of technology that you're finding?
Certainly financial institutions and banks, they're the biggest user of it, for particularly at teller positions, for checking out cash, or for authorizing transactions. Those are the most common places in which the technology like this is used. Yeah.
Yep, and sometimes, well, not sometimes, you do see a lot of check processing using static, and comparing signatures, common signatures off of checks, so that every check that Larry Torrey writes looks similar, and kind of comparing all of my checks to previous checks.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And have you had experience with courts? There's been discussion, over the years that a click-through process, an I agree button versus the biometric digitized image. The digitized image is closer to what we're used to seeing with a signature, and handwriting experts and so on. We can debate whether there's value in the experts, but are you seeing courts responding one way or the other with respect to this technology?
I can't say we've had direct experience. I haven't personally. We've had anecdotal stories from document examiners who have been involved in such things, and we know that electronic signatures have been challenged. And one of the big hurdles really was knowing whether electronic data would be accepted as evidence of identity in a court of law, and it has been. I mean, that has been accepted in several cases now.
That's
but
great.
We haven't had a lot of direct involvement. I'd love to, but typically that doesn't come our way.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. All right, well, wanted to let you know that we have a lot of great content coming up in the Digital 2020 Education Series. You can find out more about Ezra and the series on Ezra's website at www.esignrecords.org. Of course, we would hope that you would consider joining Ezra. There's membership information there as well. On behalf of Ezra and our speakers, thank you very, very much for joining us today. And again, Larry and Nick, thank you so much for your time.